Northwest family. Christian here. I was going to say I hope you're doing well, but I don't even know if that's appropriate. Life is wild right now. The world is wild and crazy. And so kind of part of what my world has looked like has been talking to a lot of friends, and especially pastors and leaders and people in the world have been asking me some questions, and I've been doing some stuff at local churches and some podcasts. And so some of these have seemed to be helpful, and I've been able to express some thoughts and share some ideas and concepts. And so I wanted to actually let you tune in to some conversations I've had recently. Hopefully these help you. I know they're being addressed to other people in different communities and different churches and different contexts, but maybe this helps add to the conversation around church and racism and following Jesus in life. And so they won't say everything. They won't be perfect. I'm still processing a lot, but maybe this can help some of you. So thanks for taking some time to listen, and I hope you enjoy.
We have Christian on, and we talked to him earlier this week about being on the podcast and asked him what are some things that he's been talking about. And I had actually already read several blog posts from Christian. And so we asked him if he'd be willing to share some of the things he's been writing about on his blog. So I'd encourage you guys to go check out his blog at christiangdawson.com and read what he has there, because it's really important and really well written. And we're going to talk about it a little bit right here, right now. We're going to be talking about church culture and racism, which is a super relevant topic with everything going on in the world right now. So Christian, to start off with, I read your blog post called "Why I Write About My Experience as a Black Man in America." And I was hoping you could just talk about that for a little bit. And I guess the question is, why is it important to you? Why do you feel like it's so important that we talk about racism in America? Why we talk about what it means, what the Black experience is like in America? And right. Even more importantly, why is it important for you to be able to share that on your blogs and all the platforms that you have to speak on?
Yeah. Well, again, let me even start by saying thank you for creating the space and giving me somewhere to share a little bit. Let me say this kind of to start. You're not asking this of me, but it's just good for me to always preface for people for having this conversation, is that I don't speak on behalf of like every Black person, their experience. Right. People have different experiences, and, even based on your own family, especially the city you live in, the part of the country, it's just different. So a little bit about me. I grew up in Des Moines, Kent, Federal Way. That kind of was my home growing up. My grandma lived on the south side of Seattle, so like Rainier Beach area. But that was basically where my home was, that area. And so I grew up in a way more like multicultural area of Seattle, which means like I actually didn't grow up in straight up a Black, like homogenous community where I grew up with only Black people. A lot of my Black friends did, but I grew up, like my best friends growing up were like Filipino and Korean, and my cousin like is Black. And then I had friends who were Russian who I was really close to. So, even my own experience and my own understanding of my Blackness is different. My mom isn't from America. She's from Ethiopia. So she was an immigrant. So while she even understands like the issues around slavery in America and racism in America, she'd experienced racism, but her family didn't grow up through like slavery. Versus my dad's side of the family, we think our side of the family came from Madagascar and were slaves that route. And anyway, and we only know so much of even our history there because of how that all happened and worked.
Right.
So, so why is it important? I grew up in a really, really beautiful multi-ethnic church. And I grew up in a space, like I said, with tons of different nationalities. And so part of the space I grew up in was a space that kind of promoted and believed in, out of good intention, believed in kind of like a post-racial society, right? And so like what I kind of grew up in a world was like, hey, like you live in a world where your best friends are Mexican and Korean and like Filipino and white. And so like racism is dead. And to some degree, yeah, like maybe in the city that I'm in, again, I'm from outside of Seattle. Like we live in a really different part of the country than people who are in Atlanta, or in Houston or in Baton Rouge. Like, yeah. And so my experiences with racism weren't overt, as in they weren't experiences where it was people who just disliked me because of the color of my skin. It was way more subtle. It was my experiences were, wasn't like I couldn't go eat in a restaurant. It's I'm more likely to be followed when I'm shopping in a store. It's when I walk around the city that I live in right now, if I'm on a walk or if I'm going on a jog or something, like I notice people will cross the street when they see me because it makes them feel more safe. It's stuff like that. It's not going to a store. It's going to a store and never seeing people that look like you. In the store in the city that you're in, So my experiences were less of like this overt aggression and way more of these subtle kind of what some might call microaggressions but just these more subtle environments that were inovert that also give a different message of, hey, you don't see people like you. And so, sure, maybe the idea of racism where people dislike you, you're not experiencing that, but you don't see people that look like you. You don't get to live a life where you're normal. And that's kind of, that's why, again, I think for a lot of people, especially in the Northwest, in Seattle, they're like, wait, I have black friends. Wait, I have friends who are Asian. I have friends who are different ethnicities. I don't carry hatred towards them. Like they come over to my house for dinner and my parents like them. And so it's hard to believe in and imagine a society that's racist when our only terms for racism have to do with I dislike you or I'm for like these lynchings or these crazy things. But it's actually the experience that's a lot more subtle that can be just as painful. And I'll shut up for a second. But I was talking to my cousin last night. She's actually married to a white dude. He's Australian, so they live on the west coast of Australia. And so we were talking the other night about all this, and she's going, I'm glad people are doing the posting, right? Like I'm glad there's awareness. She's like, truthfully, like I'm not so concerned about whether or not you're aware of it in that regard. Like racism isn't just the killings that happen on the East Coast that we don't see as much on the West Coast. Racism for me is when I'm at a wedding and someone makes that like super insensitive comment and nobody says anything. It's those moments when I'm in youth group and I know, or I'm wherever and someone kind of makes the black joke that's kind of funny, but like no one says anything about it. Like that in a form, that's a way that like I die each day. And so that's why we still got to talk about it, because it takes different faces and it has different looks than what a lot of people would see. So why do I talk about it? It's because of that. But it's not because I'm some angry guy, which I'm not even villainizing anger. Anger just means that something's wrong in the world. We have to be careful with how we use our anger and what we do with it. But anger often is just people saying something's wrong. And but I don't write just because I'm angry or just because, every time I see something, it just sends me into this spin. I honestly write because for real, I want my kids one day to have a better world. Like I want my kids, and I'm unmarried. I'm 28. I don't have kids. I'm at the age where a lot of my friends are starting to have kids. But I want my kids to actually get a little bit of a better experience than I got.
That's good. Yeah, that's a huge thing that a lot of people aren't just angry about. I think a lot of people share that with you, that they're not just angry about what's right now and what's right here, but they're thinking about, is this just going to keep continuing because it happened in the 60s and 70s and now it's 2020 and it's still happening. Mm-hmm. So how are we going to keep it from happening 20 years from now, whatever? And
right. Like, are we going to care about that? Are we going to care about the kids that aren't even born yet? I mean, I have two cousins who are 5 and 3, and they live in Oakland. And, they're hearing the gunshots in the riots right now. Mm-hmm. And my aunt is going, I don't know how much longer I can still convince my kids that they're fireworks, that they can't go outside right now because things are wild and crazy and why they are. It's just a different world to grow and raise like some black kids in right now.
Right. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And you were talking about earlier, that you grew up in church and you've been a Christian for a long time. Not only is your name Christian, but you are also a follower of Jesus. And
right. That would have been ironic if I wasn't.
And you're a pastor as well. And so obviously the gospel and your faith greatly impacts how you see the world, your worldview, and how you interact in the world, and even topics like racism and those experiences that you have. So can you talk a little bit about how the gospel and you following Jesus has impacted how you understand everything happening in the world around us right now?
Yeah. So, again, people disagree, and even within the African American community, not everyone's is on the same page. So, but to be honest, I'm Black. I'm a Christian first, and then I'm Black, and but I just like Jesus and what he's done and who he is and his kingdom. That's my first identity. And some people think that means that I have to give up my Blackness. I couldn't disagree more. Even, there's been a little bit of this weird underground comments and movement to say like Christianity is a white religion. Nothing could be further from the truth historically and sociologically. Just to kind of spit a quick fact, like if you were to do research and look at first of all, where the church started, it started in the Middle East. Then where did it move? It moved first into Northern Africa and then Asia, and then to Europe. But then although like a lot of people, those comments, they come because Europe was basically became a Christian continent. Like it became the religion, but that did not make Christianity European. And we have to understand that difference.
Yeah. Getting historical. I like it.
It's historical, right? Yeah. Like the church actually it was in the Middle East. It moved to Africa, moved to Asia, and then it did overwhelm Europe, but that does not make it a European religion. But even today, if you just want to do the numbers, look at the statistics, look at sociology, look at anthropology, if you look at who is Christians today in the world, it's actually not this like this idea of like, oh, white people are Christians, or even specifically like white men are Christians. And I don't believe in villainizing white men. Y'all are great. But if you want to look at the data and just say, when you think of a Christian, the face that comes to mind actually should be a woman of color. Like if you actually look at the demographics, look at the numbers, look at anthropology, like more than anyone else in the world, women of color are Christians. And if you look at where the church is growing, where there are the most Christians in the world, it's not in the West, it's not in America, it's not in Australia, it's not in Europe, it's in South America, it's in China, it's in Africa. You see where the church is growing, Iran, the church is growing in. And so when you think of, and it's actually typically like first and foremost, people who are oppressed, people who are minorities, people who are socioeconomically on the outskirts of society, and often women who are the first people to be Christians. And so anyway, I'm like actually losing from where I was with this whole question about, I actually forget what our question was. We're talking about why we talk about it in the church. I don't even remember at this point.
Yeah, there's so much to talk about. The main thing was just how does the gospel impact how you understand racism and how you interact with the world?
Exactly. Sorry. So I got on that train because I'm saying I'm Black, but I'm a Christian first. I'm a Christian who's Black, and my Christianity informs my Blackness, and my Blackness does speak in my Christianity. And I want to say that. And again, not every Black person agrees on that, but that's just where I'm at. And so, I think about the world that the Bible's written in, right? And I think about this God who, again, like the Bible, when you think about people in the Bible, remember their skin was brown. Like these are Jewish people. These are Middle Eastern people. Like, it's controversial, but like if you want a close picture, like you should think Osama bin Laden. It's a closer face to what Jesus looked like than who insert whatever like face you want to put in right now,
Sure, yeah.
Like he's a brown man. And so you think of this group of people who are marginalized, and they're constantly actually under the boot of other nations. They're actually a people who understand what it's like to be oppressed, who understand what it's like to be marginalized, who understand even what it's like to have soldiers walking through your streets, who understand what it's like to be socioeconomically like under the boot of another nation because they're taxing you at these super high rates and incarcerating you at these crazy amounts where like you're fearing for your life, and the stories, and you've grown up in the stories of your people being conquered. At one point it was the Philistines, the Canaanites, but then it was Assyria, and then it was Babylon, and it was Medo-Persia, and then it was Greece, and now it's Rome. And you think about these brown-skinned people who understand what it's like to be in that environment, to be at home but not ever fully feel like you're at home, right? And it's to those people that God steps into the world. And it's to those people that God actually shows up and puts on skin. And he actually puts on brown skin in some ways, which is crazy to think. And he shows up and he identifies and understands human suffering. And he understands what it's like to be in that moment and in that space. Like, that is wild, And first of all, like Christianity, it's not theology. It's not just understanding. It's not just like having the right thoughts or thinking the right things. Christianity is encountering a God, and this God that I met, this God who I encountered, Jesus Christ himself. He's a man who understands what it's like even to be brown, but also a God who understands what it's like to be an oppressed, marginalized group of people. And so all of a sudden, I'm not just praying to a God who's out there, who's powerful, or a God who's out there who just thinks things or knows things. I'm praying to a God who understands, and a God who relates, and a God who gets it. But not only that, like then I have to take on, what does this God say about the world? Well, this God says that we live in a world, first of all, that's like marred by sin. It's marred by hearts that are broken and hearts that are messed up. Like my heart has issues. I'm wrong in so many ways. Like I'm broken, and my fellow brothers and sisters, like all these people in humanity, we don't just think the problem is bad thinking. The problem isn't just bad education. The problem isn't just like things out there. It's actually my heart. Like I'm messed up. And what the Bible would call sin. It's like I'm broken on the inside, and I know the right thing, and I don't always do it, and I don't know the right, and then I don't always do the right thing, and then I see the wrong thing, and still I do it. Like there's this sin issue in me, is what the Bible talks about. And so like I have to identify the problems that are really going on. One, it's sin, it's broken people, which is why like it's not enough only to change power and change who has that. We also have to change people, and we as people have to change. But then not only that, the Bible and the biblical worldview says like there's problems with society. Like since societies are unjust. And if you just want to read if you read the scripture, you'll see time and time again that the scripture points to societies that are broken. The Bible often talks about going to the gates of the city, and the gates of the city were basically the court systems. They were the justice systems. They were the place where the courts and the laws were made and the rulings were made. And they keep talking about how you're at the city gate and the scales are tipped unbalanced. It's this idea that there's all these power differentials where people who are in power in society aren't ruling in such a way that's causing for a just society. So the Bible constantly has these issues where you're saying like, the world is broken, not just because the human heart is broken, but because societies are broken and structures are broken, and people who have power don't always use it right. Mm-hmm. And so the biblical framework is both like I as an individual has to change, but also I have to recognize that my society is likely unbalanced and unjust in so many ways. And it's not just one society. It's not just America. We have to also be okay recognizing, right? Like racism is not an American issue. Mm-hmm. Racism happens on basically virtually every country that's ever been on the planet. That's why you see racism and genocide happen in Africa, and there it's black on black. That's why you can see it in Latin America. That's why you can see it in Asia. That's why you can see it in Europe. Just because in America it's a binary with white versus black does not make America special. It just makes America unique with how racism looks. But all over the world, we see that societies have issues, right? But then and not every Christian agrees with me here, but I think the Bible gives a third piece of this worldview, and it's that there's also supernatural evil going on too. So I have to look and be willing to say, man, some of this just feels supernaturally heavy and oppressive and, dare I say, demonic in certain ways. And, we theologically might disagree there, but I think the biblical worldview would also say, man, the problem's both in me and in individuals' hearts. It's in our society and our structures, but there's also supernatural powers that Jesus actually deals with on the cross. And that's where my worldview comes into. Being a Christian means that when Jesus gets on that cross, when that brown God dies, he dies for my sin. So he dies to change the human heart, but he dies also by the hand of an oppressive society and saying I understand, but what he does is so powerful. And I'm sorry if I'm going too long, but what he does is Jesus actually takes a society and he takes the one weapon that a society has. What weapon does society have? Society has the weapon of threats of death and violence. That's the same threat on every country. At the end of the day, if you don't line up to some degree, the society will always threaten you with death every time. And what's so wild about Jesus is he says, lay down your sword. And then what does he do? Is he actually dies by the government's execution method, the cross. We as Christians just go to the cross and we think of all these other things. Y'all, Jesus wasn't unique by dying by a cross. Thousands of people died by crosses. It wasn't unique. Right. It was just horrific. Mm-hmm. And so Jesus is willing to actually undergo the most brutal form of death that the government can offer, which is crazy in and of itself. He says, you have death to throw at me, throw it at me. But then he does something so much more wild. And the resurrection, the fact that Jesus was raised from the dead, actually says that the worst form of threat that the government or that a society or that oppressors can throw at me, that's been conquered. And that, in so many ways, it doesn't take the bullet out of the gun, but it actually says that, like, oh, even if you're shot, we can get you back up again. Yeah. It's like, even if this disease kills you, we have a vaccine. I don't even have on all those languages, all those words, they fall short. So like you see on the cross, Jesus deals with the sin problem in the human heart. He deals with the societal issues that, like, violence and death that are thrown and threaten people who are often on the margins. Jesus says, to some degree, even though that threat is real, that threat is not ultimate. And then thirdly, you see Jesus, and what does he do? The cross, like even Colossians, Ephesians, Paul, he constantly says that on the cross, Jesus is putting to open shame the powers of darkness. That's why Paul can even go to say that we don't wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers and rulers and darkness of this age. Essentially, Paul is saying, there's also an enemy behind the curtain. We would call him the devil often. And we have to be willing to say that all three of those things are happening, and that Jesus is actually dealing with and is also going to return to deal with all three. And so how does my worldview, how does my Christianity inform these questions around racism? I don't know another worldview that does enough. I don't know a worldview that actually says, because, and I'm probably going too long, but like secularism and this idea of we just need to fight. Well, that's true. 100%. Christianity is not passive, but to not just have to fight and muster up my own strength, but to actually deeply believe that God is for me and with me, and God stands on the side of the marginalized and the oppressed, and that God has actually been oppressed himself and understands, and God is actually using his power to do those things in the world, and promises that he will come again and judge evil and judge injustice. What else would empower me and strengthen me when it's just hard? It's not just my own strength and my own power and my people and my brothers and sisters, my white friends and family who are working with me on this. No, it's knowing that God himself is coming and he's going to do it too. And he's already started. And so I don't know another worldview that doesn't keep your heart ultimately soft. I don't know another worldview that doesn't ultimately keep your heart from hating another person. I don't know a worldview that doesn't create hearts that actually love their enemy. As even a lot of people there's a lot of people in the Black community who don't even like Martin Luther King Jr. Because he chose to be nonviolent, because he actually called for enemy love and for loving the oppressor. But I just don't want to get to the end of this and see a world that's better, but be a person who my heart is still so angry and who I don't have actual love for my fellow man. I just have love for Black men. I want love for every person. I want love for my white friends and family, for my Latino, for every person. Yeah. I want to have love in my heart for all of them. And I think the gospel actually transforms me to a person who can actually be that.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's so much to unpack there, and you said a lot, and it's super, super important. I wish we could just sit here. I have a lot of questions for you that I'd love to just talk with you about more and just converse around this. But since we're starting to run out of time, I want to ask you one last question, which is, for all of our listeners right now, these students, high school, college, middle school, whoever is listening, what would you tell them to either encourage or challenge them? A lot of people who feel like they don't know what to say, they don't know what to do right now. They feel like everything's just crazy and they feel hopeless or helpless or just angry. What might be something that you would tell them from your perspective that could be helpful? And again, we're not asking you, like you mentioned before, we don't want to ask you to speak for all Black people.
No, you're good, man.
Yeah,
good.
And we also don't want to make it sound like you're here to teach all the white people because they can't educate themselves in any way or anything. But we think your voice is valuable, and I've loved already hearing what you've said right here in this short amount of time. But I do want to ask, in your perspective, how would you challenge or encourage those students?
I would challenge and encourage those students, first of all, to specifically African American students, and then kind of generally people of color. I just first of all say you're deeply loved and seen, that these issues are bigger than individual people. And so just to start off, just say I would just encourage, especially African Americans, to take time to be angry, take time to be sad, take time to be numb. All those feelings are good, and know that Jesus is in those spaces. That God actually shows up in those different emotions and is present with us there. But also know that, I do deeply have hope that we won't see it all, but we'll see some difference, And so I would say that matters, and that you matter, and that it's okay to have every form of feeling that you're having right now. Like, feelings are big and they're complex, and God is with you in those. I would say to just people of color as a whole, like y'all, we've had so many different experiences, and understanding that, but specifically right now, even as a person of color, you probably really relate to a lot of his situations, a lot of these things, but also there's probably parts you don't relate to. And that's okay to not feel like you don't have a place in this conversation because maybe you're not African-American, but you're a different person of color. Like, understand your perspective matters and your experiences matter. And while they're different, they still have value and meaning. And this is both a time for you to be able to share part of your experience, but also it's another time for you to listen and show solidarity. And I would say to students who are white, people who are listening who are white, one, you're loved and you're seen, and you existing, you being white is not a problem. It does not make you a villain in this story. It doesn't make you a bad person in society. You being a beneficiary of privilege, whether or not you recognize it or see it, whether or not you're rich or poor, you have certain privileges just because you're white. That does not make you a villain. And that does not, that you are a beneficiary of a system that you did not choose. It chose you. That does not make you a villain, but it does also make you responsible. Even though because you're a beneficiary, even though if you could probably give it up, you can't. And so you're not a villain, but you are a beneficiary. And that does mean you are responsible in certain ways to use the forms of influence that you have, use the privilege that you have, not out of pity, but out of genuine love for people of color, to help them in ways, not as a handout, not as a savior or messiah complex, but just to lovingly help them in ways and just be present to them and to point out things. Practically speaking, that could be something as simple. Maybe your part is posting on social media. A lot of times social media isn't as helpful as you think. So something more specific you can do is call a person of color, specifically an African American right now, and just show solidarity, ask questions, feel awkward, don't know what to say, but just say something. Say, hey, I don't know, this is awkward, but I just want to say and recognize you're going through something right now, and I love you. And if there's ways that I can learn or listen, please let me know. Do those things. Read a book, watch a Netflix documentary. Y'all are sitting at home with COVID anyway. So get a good book. Like, The Color of Compromise is a good option. Like, get a good book, read, listen to some podcasts, do some work, not to even agree with everything, but just to hear someone's experience. Mm-hmm. Realize in this moment, it's not your job to even understand everything. It's just to listen, to create empathy, and to say, how would I feel if that were me? How would I feel if that was my brother or my dad or my mom or my sister or my son or my daughter? Just put yourself in somebody else's shoes and just ask the question, would I want to experience that myself? Mm-hmm. And just start there. I just think it's a time for empathy, for listening, for courage, for making mistakes, but trying. Do those things, and then we'll go from there.
Awesome. Yeah, that's great. I think normally we'd probably have some sort of conclusion to tie it all together, but I think we don't need to. Yeah. I think you said it, and we're just going to leave it there with how Christian ended it. So thank you, Christian, again for sharing all that. Students, listen to this. Listen to it twice. Yeah. Listen to it 3 times and think about it, research it, look into it, just like Christian was saying.